If you're just joining us, you are watching the Morning Call right here on Africanews, and our show today is dedicated to Kofi Annan, the only black African to become UN Secretary General. Now, Ghana, his home country, is observing a full week of national mourning for him. The Ghanaian served 2 terms as UN chief from 1997 to 2006 and was awarded a Nobel Peace Prize for his humanitarian work. But with all that has been said about him, what can we really say is Mr. Annan's legacy? Let's find out in this report.
But I have made it quite clear.
Kofi Annan was described as a career diplomat, especially one that helped make the United Nations what it is today internationally during his 2 terms as the Secretary General between 1997 and 2007. Annan started his professional service with the UN 40 years ago. He started off working as a budget officer, then human resources, before heading the peacekeeping operations docket in 1993 and finally being appointed 4 years later to head the organization. One of his mandates has been marked by a supreme recognition, the Nobel Peace Prize, for having revitalized the UN and for having given priority to human rights. On 19th September 2006, Annan gave a farewell address to world leaders gathered at the UN headquarters in New York. His speech outlined 3 major problems of an unjust world economy, world disorder, and widespread contempt for human rights and the rule of law, which he said had worsened during his time as Secretary General. By the time he left office, Annan was one of the most popular UN leaders, although his record was briefly tarnished by corruption allegations in the oil for food program in Iraq. Although it later emerged, he was clean.
To continue and move.
Africanews journalist Victor Musio there with that report. Now, our correspondent Antoy Galindo, whom we spoke with earlier, just some moments ago, spoke with Nicodemus Fru Awesome, a professor, actually, and who is an expert in African affairs in Accra, Ghana. And Antoine asked him about Africa's stand in terms of Annan's legacy and the significance of his burial today in Ghana.
I think he's coming, the fact that he's going to be buried here is very symbolic, very important. Great personalities will be here. In Africa, burial is a political act. It's not a neutral act. So they are coming here is celebrating his greatness. In Africa, when somebody is being buried, lots of statements are made which are euphemisms, which are a recognition of what you have done, and which is a celebration actually of Kofi Annan. And I think that all African countries are united that he stood for them, and all African academics are unanimous that he tried to shape our identity internationally. So the event concerns all of Africa and it concerns the world because he saved the United Nations selflessly.
Now, in that interview, Professor Awesome then delved into what Kofi Annan stood for and how he sold Africa to the world.
When you occupy such a position, you must be very other statesman succeeded in marketing the Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals in 2000, which was supposed to be completed by 2015. Now, when we look at how the goals were conceptualized and how he was able to get the nations around the world, all the big nations, to accept that goal, this is really a great feat. And we ask ourselves, these goals were meant for whom? No matter how we go round and round, the goals were actually meant for developing countries. It was actually meant for Africa.
Very interesting viewpoints there from Professor Awesome. Kofi Annan fought for many things while serving as the UN Secretary General, and one of them was gender equality, as Professor Awesome put it. Let's hear from him again.
I would say that he worked for his continent, and he worked for everybody, because I think the issue of gender equality is across the globe. patriarchalism cuts across all races. Men always feel they are up there. It's true that in developing societies, it is more pronounced. Patriarchal societies are more like the monopoly, not really the monopoly, but it is more widespread in developing countries than developed countries. But I think that by trying to look at the issue of gender equality, he was speaking to Africa first and was speaking to the world at large in a second place. So I think there we see that there was some substantive thing he tried to do at the United Nations.
Professor Awasam there in that interview with our correspondent, Antoine Galindo. Many thanks indeed for that interview. Hanan, it's a big day. Should I call it a big day, really? Because if we look at it...
End of a chapter, really. C'est toute la fin d'un chapitre.
Absolutely, I think that's correct.
It's the end of a chapter for Ghana.
Qui sont tristes et qui vont rendre hommage donc à cette figure de la diplomatie internationale.
And this leaves me and leaves many to ask, when will Africa have such a towering figure again?
We sure hope we're going to get another one soon, because we don't want to have just Kofi Annan and he's gone.
And
now.
he's gone.
Yeah.
And it did stand for so many things, just as we've been talking about. Our show today is dedicated to Kofi Annan, who has been buried in Accra, Ghana today. This is the Morning Call right here on African News. Let's now bring you some more stories making the headlines across the continent.